Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the C.G. Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
All right, recording in progress. That's perfect. And I want to welcome you to this very special topic, and the topic is ions. And as I said, there's a very handy book. It's called Aion. It's pretty famous, and I guess it's pretty famous because it's pretty hard to explain and to understand what an ion is. Takes a lot, especially when you read the book, because the book is not so easy. And the book deals a lot with why Jesus is like a fish. And I want to explain to you why Jung is really concentrated on that fish symbology in Christianity, especially in connection to Christ. Let me share my screen, because I tried to summarize Jung's idea for this topic in a single sentence, which is: human development happens in stages. Those stages are symbolized by a specific zodiac sign, which determines the spirit of that stage. Jung calls those stages ions, named after the Mithric god of time. There's already a lot of in there. So, Jung is a very observant person, so very interested in a lot of things. This is why he's so difficult to get, because he's interested not only in psychology, but he's interested in interpersonal relationships and the deep path and religion and spirituality and stories, and also in physics to a large degree. And he tries to combine all this knowledge. So his original approach was to become an archaeologist, because he was just so interested in the ancient times. And this comes really up in his later life when he starts to investigate, okay, how was the psychology of people in the past? Because we come out of the past, we developed out of there, but we are now here today with our psychology today, and you have people in the past that just worked differently, that had a different worldview. And the question is, like, how did this happen? How could there be a difference between us today and us in the past, even though when it's only a couple of hundreds or thousands of years? And his idea was that while individual people evolve psychologically wise, he says humanity as a whole also progresses. And you see this as a certain development, especially when you're interested in the history of philosophy, that you have a different understanding of what it means to be a human being, how to evaluate the world, how to see the world. And at the same time, there are certain ideas that pop up incredibly early, but only take hold a couple of hundred or thousands of years later. Example, the Egyptians already had a battery. They already had a device where they could store electricity. And it was very primitive and it worked, but never caught on. There was no great electrification of Egypt. Also, the Greeks already had a device that could generate heat and convert it into mechanical motion. But the Greeks did not have steam engines. The Romans had fleets that were so massive that the Romans basically removed of the whole Mediterranean Sea all the trees, so that you don't have so many trees today in the Mediterranean area is because for hundreds of years the Romans fell all the trees to build their massive ships. But still, they could not sail against the wind. They basically always had to wait till the wind is at the right direction or use muscle power. And Jung asked himself, okay, why is this? Why is it that there's already a start, like a germ of something, but it's only way later that we have electricity or that we have steam engines or people sailing against the wind, which is a special technique which was invented by the Normans. And he says it's not only enough for something to be there like a seed, then also the ground needs to be prepared. He says just psychologically wise, humanity was not there yet. And he tried to understand that development, which can be very, very abrupt. Like there can be these incredibly quick changes in human development. But let's start with the individual to be a little bit closer to the things that people know from psychology, which is individual people. People are born, people grow up, and people develop personality, they develop preferences. And this way, they reveal things of themselves over time. They unfold over time. Their personality unfolds. But this development is not completely personal, even though when an individual person has a problem, it might always feel that it's a problem just to them. And the psychology that Jung saw was that it's not only you having a specific trauma, for example, or you having a specific upbringing, but you're always part of a collective. Parts in the psyche deeper are collective. This is why he separates the psyche in a personal part and in a collective part. And what makes the collective part so difficult is that it's so impersonal. It's general problems. It's problems that are not necessarily related to you, but you still have to deal with them. And this is what Jung talked about when he said, without being aware of it, the neurotic participates in the dominant currents of his age and reflects on them in his own conflict. So Jung sees the psyche as a very active thing, as a dynamic thing that pushes things to us, consciousness. He says, this where we live, what we are aware of, this is consciousness, but this is not enough. It needs to develop, it needs to grow. And it gets ideas constantly. We have certain images, ideas, plans that pop into our heads. And his idea is, okay, this comes from the unconscious parts. There's the potential already in the dark. And at certain times, it just comes up and gives people ideas, like, for example, to buy a boat or to find a partner or even a specific partner or to take up a career or pick up an interest, like, oh, I really like doing this, or I'm amazed by this person. And there are 8 billion people, but I really like this person. And Jung says this is not random. This is personal to oneself for one's development. To say, okay, there's something in this person that this is necessary for my development. So I should engage with them, build a relationship with them so that I can further my own personal psychology. This is not something that has to happen conscious, but the psyche does by itself. But at the same time, he says, okay, there's this collective thing where you not only have a role to play in your own individual life, but in the collective life, what it means to be a human being, stuff that needs to be dealt with. And this is what's meant in this quote, that there's a conflict, not only in oneself, but also in society or in culture. And the same as a culture has these problems, and each individual person kind of has to live out this conflict and has to find a solution for that. So this is what a lot of philosophers dealt with. Let's take Plato, for example. Plato was very disencouraged by the downfall of Athens. They tried to conquer Sicily, which failed horrendously, and the whole city basically came apart over time. And he saw that and saw, okay, there's this decay of civilization happening from a democracy to basically a tyranny over time. And he mapped this out, how then societies develop. And he said, oh, there's a kind of structure that's happening there. So he tried to grapple with this, what he saw, and which was there as a potential of conflicts in the underground of the psyche, and try to formalize it in some way. And Jung saw there very often these philosophers or prophets or artists as people being on the forefront that are aware of things before they happen to a large amount of people. So they're the first ones that are neurotic about the time. So we are individual, but we're also collective because we are all human beings. And the next quote deals with that. So we human beings have our own personal life. We are yet in large measure the representatives, the victims and promoters of a collective spirit whose years are counted in centuries. We can well think all our lives long that we are following our own noses and may never discover that we are, for the most part, supernumeraries on the stage of the world theater. This, for him, is one of the reasons why he looks so much into human history and human development. to see there these conflicts that are in the psyche, in this collective part, that need to move forward. And this can be summarized in one word, which is a German word, Zeitgeist, describing that there are certain preferences, certain values that pop up at specific times, like trends. And you see this very clearly, for example, in literature or in art. You have romanticism or naturalism or postmodernism today that reflect something about our psyche. For Jung, nothing is random or chance. Everything is connected, which means when human beings do something, it has to fulfill a psychological need. And it is a personal, individualistic need, but also cultural need. So if everybody is building Gothic churches, it's not a coincidence. There's something in the human psyche as a collective that needs to find its expression in Gothic style and Gothic churches to make stone look like wood and make it grow upwards. So, as a short explanation, what this collective part is. So, but what is an Aion? Aion, as I said before, is the name of the god of the Mithras cult. And the Mithras religion or cult was something that was before Christianity. Looks very interesting because it's a person with a lion's head and wings of an eagle, and it has a snake that coils around its body and presses it, basically. And interestingly enough, if you read the Red Book of Jung, where he describes his own visions, he describes this situation happening to him, that there were some snakes coiling around his body and compressing him. And only later he found out about this Mithras god. And this god stands for time. But what is an Aion time-wise? An Aion time-wise is roughly 2,000 years. The idea goes back to astronomy, saying when we, for example, count a year, we say the Earth rotates around the sun, and it takes roughly 12 months to do so, 365 days, except for leap years, where it's then one day more. And the sun as an object in space, it's not completely fixed. It also moves through space. It also has a circle that it takes over time. So this, to complete this circle, takes way longer. So long that 1/12 of it is 2,000 years, which makes it then equivalent to 1 month of the Earth. And this is called a Platonic year, just as a term. So it takes the Earth's 12 months to go around the sun, and it takes roughly 26,000 years of the sun to does its circle. And this is the basis for astronomy, but also a lot of astrology. And astrology is with the zodiacs, the animal signs of the Pisces and Scorpio and the Virgin and Gemini and all these different pictures. And what the idea of astrology is that these signs have an influence on the psychology of human beings, so that you have the stars and the planets and everything, and the constellation tells something about how human beings are in this moment right now, which is not something easy to, let's say, understand scientifically, even though the explanation is that there's vibrations coming from the stars and the planets that then influence human beings here on Earth. But Jung had a different way around it to think about this, thinking that, what human beings see when they look in the sky is shiny lights. So if they see animals there, or humans, or interactions, or history, it's rather related to their psyche, to the unconscious part of themselves. Their psyche is projected onto the night sky to then reveal something to human beings without them being aware. He says, for projection is always unconscious to the one doing the projecting. They see, there is something. And we know this from our personal lives, that we can have opinion about a certain person without really knowing that person. But we're projecting things on them, mostly bad things, like people we really don't like. We might not know so much about them, but we very know for sure that we don't like them. And Jung says, very likely they remind you of something they touch something inside of you that causes disagreement within you, like stuff you don't want to think about, especially in regards to yourself. And Jung saw that really also with astrology, and the basis there for astrology, projected psyche on the night sky, but not personal psychology, but collective psychology. So this happened roughly 3,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, that this was documented, which is one of the early civilizations, especially in the West. And it's the civilized, or let's say larger cities, that start paying attention to stars. Normally when you have hunter-gatherers, they pay attention to the moon because it's easier to track. But as soon as people start like writing and documenting stuff, they pay a lot of attention to the stars. And there you have these 12 signs that came up. And we have to put this a little bit to the side to explain, okay, why is Jung now trying to find a connection between the development of humanity and zodiac signs? And this is a classic Jungian thing by trying to connect everything and really trying to find and see patterns. We have to ask ourselves, okay, in which Aion, in which zodiac sign are we right now? And until very recently, we were in Pisces, fishes, which is a pair of fish, two of them. And it is for Jung not a coincidence that he saw all this Christian religion, iconography, and symbolism also associated with fish. Ichthys, an early name for Jesus, which means fish in Greek. And also that Jesus tells his apostles to be like fishermen and be the fishers of men, and that Catholic people eat fish every Friday. And you have all this symbolism coming up around Jesus and Christianity about fish and fishes. And Jung says this is not directly related to the zodiac. This is not the cause of that Jesus and Christianity is thought in this fish-like imagery. But he tries to connect that, and this is what he spends most of the time with it in the book Aion, which makes it then very hard to read because he just goes through many, many people and many, many documents that they have written, writing about, okay, he mentions the fish, he mentions the fish, he mentions the fish, and saying like, oh yeah, this is earlier than Jesus. So these people really wanted to talk about fishes. It's just an idea that's popping up everywhere in cultures, in discussion, in religion, in rituals, like people dress up with fishes, people get buried in fish dresses. And he says, oh, this is something already coming up in the psychology of the people. Similar as when you have a dream and there are certain images coming up. You do not know exactly what they will mean now at this moment, but they will have a meaning that will unfold over time. Like the unconscious is always a little bit in front of consciousness, because the development of the person and of consciousness as a potential lives in the unconscious and unfolds, as I said, over time, but it needs this time. So people really wanted to talk about fishes. And then Jesus came along and was associated with that. And this was right at the time when the zodiac sign of Pisces started. So for Jung, this described a lot of what happened in the mentality and tried to explain a lot of things. And we have to look earlier than that. What is before Pisces? And this way how the sun moves around the universe, it's in reverse order than we know the zodiac. So we would say, oh, after Pisces, there comes Aries. But in Aion terms, first comes Aries, the ram, and then comes Pisces. And this is a time before Jesus' birth. And here's a pretty long quote. The idea that an epoch is characterized by Aries would be a time in which the intellect developed is to a certain extent historically true. In the age between 2200 and 100 BC, human civilization and the human intellect advanced tremendously. We know little of the time before the age of Taurus, but it seems to have been chiefly a period in which the arts and crafts and the politics and strategy developed, which comes from the fact that everything influenced by Taurus is supposed to be artistic and of very earthly nature, because Taurus is a domicilium Veneris, which makes everything beautiful. That time was characterized by earthly beauty and power and empire and great conquest, etc., all of a platonic nature. But Aries was of a different quality. It is quite true that the intellect developed then. It was an age of the great philosophical development, Greek philosophy and the Vedic philosophy of the Upanishads. Yeah, this is true. Like all the development you had in Greece with Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Heraclitus and all these famous philosophers that shaped philosophy for almost 1,000 years or longer. In Europe, you had the same development happening in India and also China. And if you're interested in philosophy, it's like the development really with the same progression happened on the other side of the earth at the same time, which is like a weird coincidence. Okay, how can it be that you have completely separated cultures having the same ideas at the same time? And for Jung, the answer is always clear. And this is the collective unconscious. This is where we get culture from, where we get art from, and our development. So Jung saw there really this time characterized by Alexander the Great and also the Romans as very sophisticated people that brought big progress into like Europe and also Western civilization. But you had Alexander the Great as somebody who spread these Greek ideas to huge parts over the world. But then something happened. And this was around the time when Jesus Christ was then born, which was Christians came up, which were waiting basically for the Messiah, same as the Jews. And they were persecuted by the Romans because Christian ideas were very subsurface for the state. And we move to Pisces. The age of Pisces began coinciding with the beginnings of Christianity. As early as the 1st century, the concept of the Antichrist also became into being, referring to the second fish. Our age falls into the era of the second fish. It is the anti-Christian age. The time of the French Enlightenment coincides with the beginning of the second fish. Voltaire's, my French is not good enough for that, is characteristic of that time. So, the Romans are persecuting Christians and doing that for a very long time. But suddenly they convert, like the Roman Empire becomes the Holy Christian Empire. And Jung says this shift of huge masses does not come by chance and does not come by accident, but rather because the collective psyche was there to foster this growth. Like the seed suddenly had a ground to grow in. And this is also then what happened to the northern parts of Europe, where you had all the barbaric people who were pagans, but also easily converted to Christianity very quickly. And for Jung, this idea of Pisces, that you have two fishes, one being characterized as Jesus Christ, and the second one being characterized as basically as the antithesis, the shadow to Jesus Christ, which is the Antichrist, maps itself to the development of Europe of that time. The first 1,000 years, so half an Aion, being very spiritual, going away from this earthly, very achievement-oriented Roman types to pacifistic, spiritual, very earth-discounting people of the Christians that say, okay, yeah, this world is doomed and we will behave good now so that we can have a good life in the afterlife. And this is a complete shift of psychology happening there. But human psychology does not stop there. Then suddenly something else started, which happened around the year 2000 and especially 1500, which is a decline of Christianity, a decline of spirituality. So people are striving now out more. They are moving away from their birthplace. They are trying to explore the world. They are building ships and going to different continents, exploring them, of course, also colonizing them. But science comes up, this investigation into nature, to understand nature, not only to be in the book, in the prayer, in the spiritual realm, but rather in the material realm. And to understand that comes up like that. And we have here the French Enlightenment and also Voltaire and Rousseau and all these incredibly people and philosophers of that time that influenced their time, or rather are driven to influence their time or proclaim how the time would develop. We have people like Rousseau, but like an important person for the French development, because the reason for the French Revolution was Rousseau with his ideas. Of course, he was building onto other people like Descartes and also Voltaire and other people, but all the Jacobins from the French Revolution, there were Rousseau people. And Napoleon even said that. He said he would not exist and could not do what he do would not be for the French Revolution. And the French Revolution would not be for Rousseau. So it started with one person who had one idea, but was front running like the whole cultural development of France and then of Europe. So today we have the metric system most over Europe. And this is because of Napoleon, which is because of Rousseau. So because one guy did not like cities and had a lot of children, but give them all to the orphanage, now we count everything in meters and kilograms, which is a gross simplification, but shows like that people not necessarily have ideas, but ideas have people. And some people are very, very early. Jung, for example, saw Nietzsche as such a person who could really look deep into the cultural and collective part in the psyche and saying, okay, there is something brewing in the unconscious of Europe, especially of the Germanic people. And he talked about the Great Slaughter when people get together in group. And that was at a time where Europe was very, very, very peaceful. And yeah, he was right. First World War, Second World War. And yeah, you find this development then also earlier in philosophy. So it's all telegraphed, but it takes always a critical amount of people to really have the explosion. It is not only the little fire. All right. Much more impressive example of advent of Christ, which upset civilization and caused great slaughter. Think of the hundreds and thousands of people who went into the desert to lead an ascetic life. Whole towns were depopulated, and the monasteries were filled to the top, and even the graves were used as shelters. It was devastating. Also, there was an upsetting of individual families. That was the real reason the Romans hated Christianity so much, because it split up families and thus threatened to rip open the foundations of the Roman state. The Romans were tolerant of all sorts of religions, but Christianity, that was too devastating. This is a good example of what a new thought can do. And this is what Jung really pushes. And this is why he says to be wary of the unconscious. You can get ideas and they can take over your life. This is this famous quote that he always talks about. This idea of unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will dictate your life and you will call it fate. There are autonomous forces in the unconscious that's driving you to do things. This is emotions. This is ideas. And the scary thing about Aions, and John Peterson talks about Aion as the scariest book he's ever read, is, oh yeah, it's not only you have an idea, but everybody has this idea. And suddenly you have this huge masses of people that change directions and push for something. And in this case, like the Roman Empire, which was massive and huge and advanced, was afraid of Christianity because it said, oh, there's something outside of the state. There's something outside of the leader, the Caesar, or the emperor. There's God. And we have to fill his requirements and demands, and his moral code is the right code. And even if we get nailed to a cross, this is still the right thing because we have to follow that. Of course, this is disintegrating for a state such as the Roman state and how it was built. And as soon as the Roman state fell, even the Roman Empire, even when it was Christian, what was picked up or was picking up the reins was the church and Christianity, and that all over Europe. So new ideas are dangerous, and new people with new ideas are dangerous, like Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Rousseau. All these people and their ideas are incredibly dangerous and changing because there's not easy way to develop, even psychologically wise. Jung says that and saw this in his patients. Before transformation can take place, this ego death has to happen, where your current consciousness, which is not enough, which is not adapted enough, which is not vast enough, not sophisticated enough, needs to die in a sense so something new can be reborn. He's very interested in this symbology of the rebirth, of the change and the transformation. This is never something easy. This is why he says not everybody is enlightened, even so that enlightenment is very positive, a good state. It sounds amazing. The dark valley you have to go through and the pain and the suffering is enough to keep people away. But sometimes that's the only way to go through. So you have revolutionary ideas, and revolution always means blood and sacrifice and pain. And this is what we see through the development of humanity and the Roman Empire, but also with the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and also First and Second World War. So this is all Pisces. And he talks about how first this all was very Christian, but even when we say today, okay, the Christian church has kind of lost its shimmer and is fact, it is a process that for Jung started way earlier, because every psychological process for Jung starts way, way, way earlier before we are aware of it and before we act on it. So then by 1500, the spring point was in the commissure, the ribbon connecting the two fishes. And at the point began a mental and spiritual revolution and the decline of the church. The second fish represents the Antichrist and the decay of Christianity. The Gothic movement was vertical, and then the horizontal age of materialism, a time of great intellectual tension, voyages of discovery, were winding up with the World War, the moral defect of the spirit of Europe. I said too that we might expect a peculiar change in the mentality of the world in the next 50 to 100 years, and the time when the spring point proceeds into Aquarius. So I seem to be linking up the astronomical positions with human affairs and with peculiar changes in mentality. And for those who can count, this book was published in the 50s. And Jung talks about a development in the next 50 till 100 years, which would on it a rough pretty much now, which to the zodiac is then the age of Aquarius, which is then similar to a shift of an Aion, of a complete change of orientation and preference and value and images and ideas that come up from the old to the new, from Aries to Pisces, or from Pisces to Aquarius. And this is why these dogmas and images of religion of the past get depotentiated, similar as the pagan gods, the Romans got depotentiated over time and were then replaced by Christianity. He says a similar thing is happening right now with the next age. So, what is the next age? Aquarius is the bringing together of the fishes. You have the two. You have Christ and the Antichrist, right? Jesus and Lucifer. The spiritual and the material. And separated in time. But he says, now the water bearer holds both fishes in his vessel. So it's now the combination, the bringing together of both. And this is not an easy process. And he says, oh, there's a symbol that dreams are using, and like that also alchemy is using, all this image that pops up everywhere. And this is the image of the hermaphrodite. The hermaphrodite is, however, an archetype. It represents unification of opposite pairs and is probably a duality symbol corresponding to Aquarius, and would therefore correspond to approximately the same value as the fish symbolism in the beginning of our era. So the hermaphrodite combining both the male and the female. And I always have these ideas, thoughts where I think, okay, yeah, Jung can write a lot, and Jung has many, many ideas. But how to know whether he's right? Because all the stuff he's talking about, it's pretty hard to prove. But when I read that, I thought, okay, Like, what is one very big cultural problem right now that gets discussed and which was not a topic until a couple of years ago? And this is this topic of transgenderism and trans people. Like, oh yeah, people who are male or female or can switch or even both at the same time or neither or something like that. Like hermaphrodites. I thought, wow, okay. This is such a weird coincidence that Jung talks about this 50, 70 years ago, and then it pops up just in this cultural way. And he says, oh, yeah, the alchemists, the Middle Ages, they already talked about this stuff. And he says, there's the next quote, that the hermaphrodite itself is just a stage because it's still not unified. It's like you still try to mesh two things together to create something new. But he says, oh no, it has to be something completely new born out of that. We can say that the hermaphrodite is usually the symbol that precedes individuation, that precedes the creation of the valuable center of the precious diamond. Therefore, it is still not a satisfactory state, as you see from the alchemistic pictures. That figure with the two heads is too monstrous. There is no absolute liberation from the pair of opposites. The reconciling symbol should be something entirely new and detached, and the opposites should be overcome. Otherwise, it is not a reconciling symbol. The hermaphrodite shows that man is still torn asunder, and he is only on the way of completion, all-roundedness. And this is something that you would expect from psychology, also from Jung. Most ideas and thoughts that we have, or symbols that come up, they are incomplete. They're always a starting point. They are a way to something that lies in the future, that needs elaboration, like our understanding of Jesus or Christianity at the year zero was not what it was 100 years later, 500 years later, 1,000 years later, or not 2,000 years later, but rather it needs an elaboration and it needs development intellectual-wise, and it will bring huge upheavals and destruction, as every new idea does, which is the horrifying part, that humanity is kind of developing and it's not really in our reins. It is to a certain degree. We can go along, we can elaborate on these things, but there's this collective psyche in us that is pushing for things, it's pushing us forward. So it's preventing us or not enabling us to sail against the wind now, but in 1,000 or 1,500 years later. And we cannot imagine really what it will be in the future. And we have to go through all these stages, similar as in psychological development of a patient, right? He says the patient very often, they only have one problem. That's the problem they shake away from. There's tasks they need to do, and they do not attend to that. So their whole life becomes out of balance until they have solved this thing. And when they've solved it, they're reborn, they can progress, and they progress to something new, like individuation, individual development. It never ends, even though that it has a point where it's oriented towards self, the completeness of the psyche. It's always steps in between. There's always new challenges, always new things to solve and to grow on and to develop. But this is where, for Jung, we are right now, psychologically wise. And it is very hard, not very hard to get, but a little bit hard to believe. This is why there needs to be a lot of groundwork for Jung and to understand why Jung is interested in that. And this is the idea of connecting everything and of development and not knowing, like, humanity is doing stuff and only understands hundreds of thousands of years later why it has been doing something. And the seeds are early there, but are only coming into fruition later. And we see, 3,500 years ago, somebody in Mesopotamia saw fishes in the sky and a water bearer and a ram and had associations with that were pulled up from the collective. And it's like the collective is unconscious telling, oh yeah, like the vertical fish, this is spiritual. And this horizontal fish, this is material. And if you're very into astrology or know people, they're very often super interesting people. They have this characteristic of the ages and all this stuff basically laid out. And the question is, okay, how true is that? And for me personally, it's a little bit a tough pill to swallow But Jung was very interested in that. And he wrote this. This is an incredibly hard and challenging book over 10 years and published it with 75. And this is what I personally find interesting, to be this aware and intellectually capable to publish such a book at such an advanced age. And it was only like a side chapter that became a whole book of his magnum opus, Mysterium Connectionis, which deals with alchemy. But I wanted to explain to you what an Aion is. And this was my explanation or my try for it to say, okay, yeah, humanity has stages, violent stages, and they could be mapped on the zodiac. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you learned something. And that would conclude my presentation part for today.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.